Welcome, Christina. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss the Exiles.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
And we just did, as we were chatting about before the podcast, we just did this fantastic event for the North Castle Public Library together last week, but it wasn't recorded. So we're going to do it again as a podcast, but at least now I got all this inside information about you from that. So sort of like a extra prep session, but I promise this is being recorded. So we're all good.
Okay, perfect.
So let's start with the Exiles. Can you please tell listeners what it's about and what inspired you to write it?
Sure. The Exiles is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when British colonists landed on their shores. That is the sort of epic version of the description. It's about three women, essentially, who are transported, and there's one Aboriginal girl who ends up living with a British aristocratic family, and it's not so exciting for her and fun. So I read a piece in the New York Times maybe a decade ago that was in a column that Lisa Belkin used to have called Motherlode. And to Zibby, I think you've contributed to it.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Much less highbrow of a piece, though. It was about like my being sad I couldn't go to like kids in sports or something with them anymore, and I had to sit on the sidelines. So anyway.
That's totally fun. Well, I was a mother of kids in the parenting needy ages, and so I always read it. And this one column happened to be about the convict women and how they took care of their children on the ships, which were often repurposed slaving ships, headed to Australia for 4 to 6 months at sea. And I read that and I got this sort of tingle, and I realized this is what I want to write about next. And it was totally intimidating because it's in the 1840s and it's in Australia and England, neither of which I've really written about. I've written a little bit about, one of my novels has a character who's English. I grew up in England for 9 years. I was born there and I have dual citizenship. So I feel a little bit on sturdier ground with that, but not so much with Australia. So I knew it would be a big project, but I had been obsessed with Australia ever since going there as a Rotary Fellow in my 20s. And I loved it. And I became really interested at the time in the story of the convicts, because of course, Australia was founded as a penal colony and 20% of Australians today are descended from convicts. And also learning about what had happened. It's a similar sort of parallel or inside out version, I suppose, of our own story of British settlers coming, British settlers coming into America and taking over. So it was fascinating to research. But I also have taught in a women's prison, and I did a book on feminism with my mom and interviewed all these women for it, and sort of through those experiences, all three of them came back when I wrote this book, kind of came together.
I can't believe that 20% of the people in Australia still are descended from, isn't that crazy? You would think that it would be like mayhem and disorder, and yet it's like the place everybody just wants to go visit, and they're so laid back. What do you think that's about? That's crazy.
I do think that the Australian sensibility is in part because of their origins as a penal colony. You know, these people came from a very stratified world in Britain, where there was no social mobility. You could not go up and down the social ladder, and there were no social programs, and the poor were just stuck at the bottom. And they got to Australia, and even though the journey was difficult and prison life was definitely not fun, if you got out, and in fact, one descendant of a convict said to me, you know, our character is forged out of having survived all this and then being able to start anew and having all kinds of social mobility once they got out, becoming entrepreneurial, for example, and also this sort of irreverence and this kind of humor that you see a lot of Australian people share. I do think that there's something about that journey that was very specific, and it makes them different than Americans. It's just they weren't formed by religion was never part of the forming of that country, and it's a very different feeling.
Well, I am sort of deep in American history these days. So I've been helping my 13-year-old daughter study for her social studies test. So it's very fresh in my mind exactly how we became a country. So that's all super interesting and sort of timely for what's going on in my house, at least. But yeah.
I love how these separate colonies show us different iterations of the effect of British colonialism.
And how did your family end up, like, why were you born there and why did you leave in the UK?
So my parents are Southern, and they met at college. And my dad was actually in a seminary. He was going to become a minister. They were raised Southern Baptist, and he got a fellowship for a summer to go to Cambridge and study with Owen Chadwick, this very famous theologian. And my father was the first person to graduate from 8th grade in his white trash Southern family, basically.
Wow.
Whereas my mother had come from a long line of teachers. So they were these two very different backgrounds. And I think she influenced him because he agreed to go to Cambridge for the summer. He thought it was just for the summer. And then he fell in love with learning there and became a professor. He got a PhD studying with Owen Chadwick. He became a professor of British labor history of all things. My parents became total hippies and threw off their Baptist shackles, I guess. And it was also at the height of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the women's movement and all that. And they were very radically involved with all that stuff. And so then when we moved back to the South, and my father, and they were sort of rabble-rousers, and finally my father was fired from this conservative college he was teaching in, an all-male college, for anti-American activities, for like housing draft dodgers or something. And so they moved to Maine, and he became a professor at the University of Maine, because I think that was as far as you could get from the South without going to Canada. So that's just a circuitous way of saying that was how we ended up in England. And my parents became huge Anglophiles, and my mother's sister married a novelist. And so we have relatives over there now. And my children even have dual citizenship because I was born there. So it's kind of wonderful. If Trump had, sorry to be political, but if things had not changed, we were very much considering, I don't know if you know Jane Green.
Yes, of course. Yes.
She's just relocated to London.
I know. And I've been watching her redo her house on Instagram. It's been very fun.
Don't you love it?
Her room, her like wallpaper, painting, whatever. Yes, I love it. Her bathroom. It's fantastic. Yeah.
She's so fun.
She is so fun.
So we're sort of living through her. I'm sort of living through her.
Yes, me too. And this also gives more context because the other night we discussed your dad and how you didn't mean to, but ended up emulating his deep research skills, and how you thought you were a novelist only, and that you sort of poo-pooed that whole, cerebral, like sitting, just pawing through research. And yet your historical fiction has become, a cross between him and what you thought you were going to do. And now that I hear his trajectory, it's even more interesting. So tell me.
Yeah, I mean, he was sort of an autodidact, I guess you would say. For a long, growing up. And then the more educated, he just was in love with learning always. And so, but he was meticulous, and he has like a dozen books, and like I'm really proud of him, because his brother and sister then went to college also. And, then of course, subsequent generations. So it's like this American success story of education changing your life kind of thing. But yeah, I started out writing contemporary novels, and I loved that. And I stumbled into the Orphan Train story because my husband's grandfather was an Orphan Train writer, was featured in this article. None of us knew he was dead, and we discovered that he had this whole past that my mother-in-law never knew. So Orphan Train, only a third of that novel is set in the past, 100 pages, but that's what people think of when they think of the novel, and obviously the title and all of that, but also because it was just such an unusual, people didn't know the story, even though 250,000 American children went on trains to the Midwest in a labor program, and ending in 1929. So that was how I got into researching. And I realized it's terrifying to write about the past. You know what? I remember reading a book by Catherine Harrison, a novel that was about foot binding. I think it was, she wrote contemporary books and novels and memoirs. And then she wrote this book set in the past. And my first thought was, why would she do that? That's so weird. And then my second thought was, that's way too hard. I could never do that. I would never presume to understand any culture other than my own. That seems ridiculous. And then Orphan Train, I sort of was terrified every second that I was writing the stuff set in the past, but I kind of learned I could do it. And then the next book was a whole different challenge about Andrew Wyeth and the subject of his pain in Christina's world. And then this book was an entirely different challenge. But I guess writing Orphan Train made me realize that here's a big lesson for aspiring writers. Don't box yourself in. Don't tell yourself what your style is or what your subject is or what your interests are or what you're capable of. You never know. And if you take chances, you'll surprise yourself always. And it might not always work, but in the case of my writing these books, like I wrote my way into learning that I could write this way.
And that you obviously liked it. I mean, you must have enjoyed it to be able to write.
That was the thing, right? That was your original point. That my father, his research style and everything, I thought like, I will never do that. And I do that. I do that. I take notes the same way he did. And we both write longhand. We talked about that the other night. And yeah, I love that part of it. With that said, I did an event with Lily King last month, and we were
I love her too. She's
amazing. I know, I love her too. She's so great. But she has written a contemporary novel after writing one set in the past, and she's like, oh my God, it's so much easier. And I was reminded that it is a little easier to write about the world you know. And so at some point I will definitely do it again. And maybe I'll bring some of what I learned about this stuff to the present day, but we'll see.
But then you said your next one, you're like making the same mistake again by delving into Civil War history. And
it's so stupid. The Civil War is like the worst period to write about because there are so many real experts. I mean, what am I doing? So I'm just it's about two couples and I'm just going to sort of hew closely to their world. So
you know what? It's great. I mean, you obviously enjoy challenging yourself on some level, and that's okay. I mean, you're doing it. I mean, maybe it's too easy. Maybe you thrive on it. I don't know.
You know what? Here's another secret that's not secret. I think that writing about the past in some ways makes it easier to have, makes plot easier, because writing about the present is sort of amorphous. And if you're writing about people in your own sort of world in a way, then you have to make terrible things happen to them. I mean, something has to happen in a novel. So you put people through misery in one way or another. That's sort of the plot of every novel. And in some ways, writing stories set in the past gives you more of a frame for the story. And that's what I have trouble with. Like, the words on the page are one thing, but really the structure and the plot, I could just write and not have a plot, but that is not how a novel works either.
I was just talking to people about some Holocaust era fiction, and how just knowing it's about World War II or the Holocaust or something, you already know the general plot. You might not know the sub-stories and exactly what the book's about, but you already are like moved and emotional, and you know where your emotions are going to go because of that. So it's almost like no, this is going to come out the wrong way. It's not cheating, but you're relying on an inherent structure, which is sort of what you're saying about some of your stories. Not cheating, though, of course. You're like,
no. I totally know what you mean. And actually, like, I've never
riding that wave.
I am flabbergasted at the ongoing interest in novels about World War II. And of course, I get them all across my desk, in advanced reading copy form, because I write about the past. So, but I can't, it's amazing to me, the appetite for World War II fiction that doesn't end. And in fact, I was talking to an editor about it who said, we really thought it was a trend that, you know, they have all these trends in publishing, like chick lit, whatever, and then you never hear that anymore, right? But she said, what we're finding is that there's an endless appetite. Like, not all the books succeed, but you're exactly right. And I actually, Zibby, had never thought of it that way, that it is about knowing what you're getting in a certain way when you read a book about World War II, especially a novel, and not to generalize too much, but a novel by women with a certain kind of figure on the cover is going to yield a certain kind of story about World War II.
Yeah.
So,
and if you like that, then you can just keep dipping into that well. But
I mean, one of the things for me is that I don't want to, and maybe someday I will, but I don't want to revisit the same territory. So even though I've written 3 books set in the past, they're all very different from each other, and they're all very different parts of the world and
well, it's not like the past is limiting. I mean,
right.
I mean, anything, anywhere. It's like the world is your oyster. You could do this forever. I mean, you probably will do this forever, right? I mean, there's an endless amount of really interesting things, and particularly with the Exiles. I mean, I didn't know a lot about this at all, and I feel kind of like a moron, like even with all the things that I've learned from you about it. But even the idea of being like trapped on a boat with your children for 3 to 6 months, even that alone, that little tidbit, when like I can't even like drive from here to the grocery store with all 4 of my kids sometimes. And I'm like, how do people do that for months on end with like no iPads or nothing to distract them?
Nothing. Oh God, I know, it's just amazing what they went through. But we don't know the stories of the poor and the dispossessed, because those are not the people who write history, who write the history. You know, history is wars and presidents and generals and treaties and robber barons and you know, and the wealthy and the educated, the people who are in power. And the people I write about are not in power, are not the people in power. They're the quiet stories. They're the stories that nobody has heard. And you know, this story of the convict women, as you say, every continent has its own stories like this, and a lot of them are still ongoing. So that's one of the things that writing about the past opens you up to, I think, is the realization. I think we talked about this the other night too. Sorry.
That's okay.
The realization that yes, things have changed in some amazing ways, and it's great to recognize that. But a lot of things stay the same. Character is the same in some ways. In other words, the feelings that we feel today are the feelings people had in 1840 are as real and as deeply experienced as the ones we have today. And I think that's what I try to do in these novels, is to stay very close to the bone in terms of making my characters feel as if they could live now, so that readers experience these situations through their eyes in a way that feels familiar in some ways. I'm not trying to approximate what someone wrote like in 1840. I'm writing as a contemporary writer about the past. And so if the books succeed at all, I think it has something to do with that sort of impulse to make it feel fresh and modern, to make 1840 feel as relevant as, 2020.
Which you totally did. And you also do it by letting the reader into sort of the inner world of your characters. And even though, like, if you were to see a picture, not even that there were pictures, but, like a sepia toned, brown and white picture, people seem so different, right? They must look, but they're not. Like the child, I always forget her name,
Mathena.
Thank you, Mathena. Is still just she's an orphan who's doesn't want to go off with strangers. I mean, that's any child today, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Of course, you poke fun at the people who actually were real people in real life, with their snootiness and wanting to dabble in basically child snatching for their own amusement.
Right.
So you immediately put us there, and it feels so real, which is great.
When I was researching Orphan Train, I was at New York Public Library a lot, and the Lewis Hine collection of photographs of immigrant children working in factories, the lives of the poor, really interesting stuff. And a friend of mine on Facebook, Margaret Bruchuk, is doing a project where she's working with an expert colorist, and they're taking his photographs, and it's stunning. I'm going to send you one of them.
Oh, good.
It looks like my child or me, or it's standing there, because she makes it like as if it's today. And this kid standing on a factory floor, and you're like, wow, this is not this cracked sepia tone, photo. This could be now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's cool. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do, I guess, is a written form of that idea of colorizing, of making a story come to life that seems as if it's in the dusty pages of an old book.
And tell me about all the different movie-ish, whatever adaptations of the various projects you have going on.
Well, my 3 latest novels have all been optioned. 2 for, does the big screen even exist anymore?
I don't know.
Movies. And the latest one for a series, which is where everything is going these days. And the team that bought The Exiles is all female. They're half in Australia, half in Sydney, half in LA, and they're just so fun and wonderful. And I'll be executive producing and hope to be quite involved. COVID has delayed everything, but they did Big Little Lies and The Undoing that we saw recently on HBO, and
which we watched start to finish from like 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. nonstop. We could not get off the couch. Whole thing. I couldn't believe it. This was like last weekend, by the way.
Well, don't you live somewhere near where they filmed the house?
Yeah, I live in the middle of every scene. I felt like I was in the movie, and I'm glad I watched it while I was in the city, because I was like, she could have been walking down my block as I was watching it. Yes.
Totally. I just found it really, fun and stylish, and anyway, I think all of us got a little boost in the dark days of November watching that.
I have heard from some Upper East Side moms, like, nobody would dress like that. So anyway, but we'll leave that, alone. Anyway, well, Christina, thank you for doing another, conversation with me. That's so fun. I feel like I could just like chit chat with you about your work and why you do the things you do. And, next time
we'll talk about you, because you have a very interesting life, and I want to hear more about it. And I can't wait till we can hopefully get together in person.
Me too. That'll be great.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was so delightful, and I'm thrilled to have gotten to do it twice.
Yay. I hope it's entertaining for people.
It was entertaining for me, so that's all I care about.
That's good. Well, have a great day, a snow day.
Yes.
And hope to see you again.
You too. All right.
Bye.
Bye.